Welcome back to Beyond the Bible. Today we're taking a look at the different Jewish sects during the time of Jesus. A sect is a group that is separate and distinct from other groups, in this case, religious groups. They're somewhat akin to modern-day denominations in various religions. But before we delve into each Jewish sect, we need to understand the background that gave rise to these different groups. In the year 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was defeated by the Babylonian Empire and came under Babylonian rule. However, in 539, when the Persian Empire defeated Babylon, many Jews who were exiled from their homeland were allowed to return. Additionally, the people were allowed to rebuild the temple that had previously been destroyed. This second Jewish temple was completed in 515 BC. While the temple was restored, the Jewish monarchy was not, creating a power vacuum. The religious leaders were now the dominant local power and voice. The question was, who would ultimately rise to the top? The Jews continued to be ruled by numerous successive empires until the mid-2nd century BC, when Israel obtained self-rule for approximately 100 years with the help of a family called the Hasmoneans. And that's where things get interesting. Suddenly, multiple groups started forming alliances with other world powers, trying to grab power for themselves. There was tons of corruption and intrigue, and the legitimacy of certain leaders was called into question. It's at this point that these different sects really started to be defined. These groups had very different philosophies, and in many ways represented the varied responses to the Jewish crisis of identity. Everyone was trying to answer the question, who are we, God's people, supposed to be? And how are we supposed to act in relation to the global climate around us? Even though these are religious sects we're talking about, the whole ordeal was really quite political. By the time we get to Jesus, Rome had taken over the known world, including Palestine, but the Jewish sects remained. At that point, the power hierarchy became Rome at the top, then a local puppet ruler, like Herod, for example, and then the temple, with the religious leaders exercising power locally on the people. When it comes to the religious sects of Jesus' day, most of our information comes from two main sources, the New Testament and a man named Josephus, a Jewish historian from the 1st century AD. There are a few other smaller sources of info as well. But what we learn from these sources is that there were three main Jewish sects in the 1st century AD: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. Let's start with the Sadducees. Many scholars believe the name for this group comes from the Old Testament name Zadok. Zadok was a descendant of Aaron, who was Moses' brother and the first high priest. And while we're not sure if this is the actual etymology of the word Sadducees, it does make some sense because the Sadducees maintained control of the affairs of the temple for quite some time. And this is because they were a party of wealthy priests. They were known to sit frequently on the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish high council. And the Sadducees were the dominant religious power in Palestine in the 1st century AD. They might not get as much airtime as another Jewish sect we're going to talk about in a minute, but they definitely had the most control. And like any religious group or sect, the Sadducees had philosophies and teachings they abided by. They were very vocal about the people supporting the maintenance and procedures of the temple structure. For their scripture, they only used the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They discounted the prophets and other religious writings. They did not believe in resurrection and also weren't big on angels, spirits, or any other supernatural beings. What they were big on was staying in power and aligning themselves with whoever could help them maintain their power. The next group is the Pharisees. This name is probably derived from the Hebrew word parush, which means separated. After the Hasmonean period began, the Pharisees vied for political leadership. See, the Sadducees favored Hellenization, which is the process of Greekifying the world. They were just fine with the imperial leaders who kept them in power. The Pharisees resisted Greek assimilation, and they were on the side of the Hasmoneans, who were essentially freedom fighters. And when the Hasmoneans were able to take over and give Israel independence, the family who ruled not only claimed the throne, but installed themselves as high priests, even though they were not descended from Aaron. At one point in time, there was a rift between two Hasmonean brothers who were trying to claim the throne. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were on opposite ends of that conflict. Both sides appealed to Rome, hoping for their aid and backing. Instead, the Romans just decided to take over for themselves, ending Israel's self-rule. Throughout the years, both the Sadducees and Pharisees attempted to align themselves with various external ruling powers at any given time. These two sects seemed to fight against one another a decent bit. Check out Acts chapter 23 to see how Paul got out of a hairy situation by using these two groups' animosity toward one another to his own advantage. The Pharisees also had teachings. For them, the Torah was central, but they also viewed the prophets and the writings as good. Additionally, they developed an oral law or tradition, which in their view helped keep the written traditions in touch with the culture all around them in their present day. The Pharisees were very strict in their interpretation of ritual and purity laws. In the 1st century AD, they were quite well received by the public. They were a minority to the Sadducees, but a big minority, and pretty popular. There are some fairly famous Pharisees that are talked about in the Bible. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee who received his training in Jerusalem from a man named Gamaliel, another somewhat famous Pharisee mentioned in the Bible. There's also Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, both of whom had encounters with Jesus. The Pharisees get a lot of airtime in the Gospels, and Jesus seemed to be constantly in conflict with them. In some ways, Jesus and the Pharisees actually inhabited similar territory. Neither of them were fans of those who try to control others through power and wealth. However, unlike the Pharisees, Jesus was also not a fan of controlling people through laws and rituals. For Jesus, it was about selflessness, loving God and others, and desiring to follow after God by getting your heart right and walking in obedience. Today, the Pharisees get a pretty bad rap. Some of it is admittedly rightfully deserved. However, it can get taken a bit far at times. Maybe you've heard of the adjective pharisaical, meaning excessively or hypocritically pious. Some people, such as modern Jews, actually take some offense at that particular term, considering it to be pretty insulting. To them, that term is insinuating that being religiously devoted is a bad thing. Well, it's just best for us to be mindful of the terms that we use in order to avoid unfairly demonizing someone. Our last Jewish sect is the Essenes. This group was described by Josephus and another Jewish author named Philo. Now, this group is not mentioned in the New Testament. This is probably because they lived on the fringes of society. This group went out into the wilderness and lived remotely. Many scholars actually believe that the Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran was a branch of the Essenes. The Essenes believed that the right way to live was to withdraw from society and wait for God's timing and intervention. They had a very deterministic view of the world. They felt that the proper thing to do was to be prepared for God's intervention by maintaining strict holiness. In many ways, the Essenes lived an ascetic lifestyle. They despised riches, sharing their common property. They rejected the flesh to a fault, with most Essenes choosing not even to marry, though a few did in order to maintain posterity. And just like the Pharisees, they too had very rigid practices. In the end, the Jewish temple was destroyed by Rome in 70 AD. At this point, the Essenes were decimated, and their numbers dwindled. Likewise, the Sadducees fell out of vogue and lost their power. kind of hard to rule when there's nothing left to rule. The Pharisees ended up winning out, and their teachings carried on, eventually becoming rabbinic Judaism. In fact, practically all modern Judaism can trace its roots back to rabbinic Judaism, and therefore to the religious sect of the Pharisees. There are certainly some takeaways that I find from studying these groups. First, it's very dangerous for religion to align itself with the state. At some point, you either get sucked in way too deep, compromise your beliefs, or get discarded and turned against. This is a lesson Israel continually failed to learn. Like how in the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel constantly sought the help of either Egypt or Assyria rather than God's help. Second, it's definitely possible to believe that God will work powerfully, but also still be involved yourself. This is how Jesus operated. Jesus called people to be in the world, but not of it, rather than trying to get away from the world altogether. Finally, I think it's fair to say that all three of these sects got some things right, but also had their flaws, which is pretty similar to modern religious denominations when you think about it. Devotion to God is more important than devotion to tribe. Jesus tried to shoot the gap, cutting straight to the heart and revealing truth to all peoples, both the lowly and those in power. Hopefully you now know just a little bit more about these important characters that Jesus spends so much time with in the Gospels. But for now, that's our look beyond the Bible. See you next time.